has been the title entrusted to me, Integral Ecology and Catholic Social Teachings. The next slide, please. Can we go full screen, please? Thank you. Laudato Si, as soon as it came out in 2000. The next slide, please. Yeah, can we go full screen? This was, as soon as the encyclical came out, Dale Jamieson, who teaches at New York State University, said that this is the most important environmental text of the 21st century. Right at the beginning of Laudato Si, Pope Francis says, can we go to the next slide? Yeah. Pope Francis says, thank you. It's my hope that this encyclical letter, which is now added to the body of the Church's social teaching, can help us to acknowledge the appeal, immensity, and urgency of the challenge we face. Next slide, please. So I would like to present very simply 7 flashes, 7 characteristics or elements of integral ecology. Pope Francis in Laudato Si has an entire chapter on integral ecology, which begins like this. Since everything is closely interrelated, and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, I suggest that we now consider some elements of integral ecology. So these are the 7 traits I would like to present to you. Next slide, please. The first thing about integral ecology is the metaphysics, the philosophy. Human life is grounded in 3 fundamental and closely intertwined relationships with God, with our neighbor, and with Earth itself. So this is what integral ecology is about. Next slide, please. And this is modeled on the very Holy Trinity. You know, we often do not emphasize this, that Christian religion is unique because we are the only people who speak of God as community. If you have to reflect on this, it's about relationships, and that is our model. I've got it since not to lose time. Next slide, please. Yeah. And we have a beautiful model of this in St.FrancisofAssis, who inspired Pope Francis. You know, he was profoundly a man of God. He was in love with creation, and this is the day he embraced the leper. And this is the beauty of every Christian spirituality. A saint or a martyr is someone who falls in love with God, with humanity, and with Mother Earth. Next slide. So second sign of integral ecology is that it is able to respond to the signs of the times. Right at the beginning of Laudato Si, Pope Francis says, I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. And next slide. And just last year, as John Muntel before me mentioned, Pope Francis gave us Laudato Deum. And if you have to compare both the documents, in Laudato Deum, Pope Francis is really worried. Just the last part, he says, yet with the passage of time, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate, while the world in which we live is collapsing and maybe nearing the breaking point. Next slide. And we are seeing it. I just chose one example. If you remember the summer we passed, the floods in Brazil, the heat wave in India, the heat wave in South Sudan, the floods in Germany, the floods in Italy, everywhere. I just wanted to highlight South Sudan because I think we don't speak sufficiently about what is happening right now in South Sudan. They say this is the largest human catastrophe in course. There are no political, no military, no economic interests. So we speak about other wars, rightly we should, but we are neglecting South Sudan, where schools were closed for more than 2 weeks this summer because of the heat wave. Next slide, please. And the third sign of integral ecology is this. It's not about environmentalism. It speaks of Earth as our common home. Laudato Si has this subtitle on the care for our common home. Next slide, please. I teach cosmology, and allow me, for a second to deviate. Right now, our universe has a diameter, they say, of 93 billion light years. Imagine, light from one end to the other will take something like 93 billion light years. And the small image you see is the James Webb telescope we sent 2 years ago, which is found just 4 times farther than the moon. So it is revealing to us a magnificent view of the universe. Next slide. But this entire universe, and this is magnificent, really is wonderful. If there is a place we can call home among 2 trillion galaxies, it is Mother Earth. It's where we are. This, some of you recognize, is the image of Earthrise, 1968, Apollo 8, that the penultimate mission, the last one landed on the moon. The previous one, their task was to photograph the moon. And as they were photographing the moon, this huge surprise came. Earth rose on the horizon. And that's the reason I think Pope Francis chose the care for our common home as the subtitle. And as I said, he was inspired by St. Francis in writing the encyclical. And we know St. Francis' history, that the day he went to Sant'Amiano in Assisi and sees the crucifix, and the crucified Lord speaks to him, says, Francesco, va e ripara, in that context, my house. And this time it is Francesco, va e ripara la nostra casa. Francis, go and repair our home. So if you have understood, I think this slide, this is integral ecology. This is the mission to which Pope Francis is calling us to rebuild our common home. And this time not just the crucified Lord, but as you see also the indigenous chief, the polar bear, little birds, everyone telling Pope Francis, help us. Next slide, please. The fourth sign of integral ecology is to understand together the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Next slide. Because it is both a physical and a moral problem. Physical because this is a very important study called the planetary boundaries. And this is very pedagogical because in the center you have the color green, and if humanity were to remain there, then we are safe. So what they did, the scientists, in 2009 already, they identified 9 sectors. And already in 2009, in 3, we had gone far beyond. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, that the nitrogen cycle due to agriculture. This study was updated in 2015, and we have reached in 6 sectors. Last year they added 1 more sector. So imagine out of 9 sectors, in 7 we have gone beyond the safety zone. Next slide, please. And today what scientists are afraid is of what we call crossing tipping points. That if you are to go beyond some of these tipping points, we can never come back. And allow me to highlight the Greenland, for example. The Greenland in the North Pole has unfortunately begun to melt. And the Greenland alone can raise sea levels by 7 meters. So by the end of the century, we are expecting something like 1 meter. And the problem is, once this process begins, we cannot stop the day after. This will go on for thousands, if not for millions of years. Last week, we were told that the Antarctic has begun to green. And Antarctic means 40 meters of sea level rise. So God help us. And so we need to see all these things together. And look here, the Amazon rainforest, which will condition how much snow will fall on the Himalayas, to say that everything is connected. Next slide. And it is also the cry of the poor, because as Pope Francis says, both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. Now, Laudato Si, the climate is mentioned 14 times, but the poor 59 times. Next slide, please. Because it affects important areas of human welfare, food security, health, and migration. We speak so much about migration. In the Dicastery 2 years ago, we did a study on climate crisis and displacement. And we found today ecological factors, the climate crisis in particular, cause 3 to 10 times more displacement than all political factors. Next slide. And the great injustice. John, my colleague, before me spoke about Africa's contribution to the Laudato Si Action Platform. But I think it's not a question of charity, it's a question of justice. You look at this map, or rather 2 maps of the world. On top, we have the map of the world regarding the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that cause the climate crisis. You see the US, Europe, India, maybe also for the population, China, and you don't see Africa on the top. Africa emits something like 4% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Below, we have the map of the world. According to mortality, people die due to the climate crisis. So this is what Desmond Tutu called the ecological apartheid, that we are living in 2 worlds. Next slide, please. And it's all over. It's in some parts of the world. I think of the city of Mumbai, where the richest person in Asia has a house of 27 floors. And you see the same in Jakarta or Nairobi or anywhere. And so you see these two women. One, those who can afford to really consume, and on the other side, the woman who ends her day resting in that way. Next slide, please. That's why Pope Francis says, today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Next slide, please. And the last 3 signs of integral ecology, that it offers us an integral perspective in judging the crisis of our common home. Laudato Si 2nd chapter has this title, The Gospel of Creation. Next slide, I don't want to take too much of time. Because as Pope Francis reminds us, creation is God's first and primordial revelation, that God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. And creation is indeed the very first epiphany of God. Next slide. But the problem is, as Pope Benedict pointed out, the day he became Pope, in the homily he said, the external deserts are expanding because the internal deserts have become so vast. The problem is there. And it's also a philosophical problem, because we are placed out, see this image of, we are eating our own, destroying our own common home, because it's a culture of use and throw. And the last 2 points that we conclude. Yes. Next slide, please. So how do we respond? Through politics, through economics, through education, through the 3 pillars that Pope Francis suggests in Laudato Si. Next slide. The politics, its role, vocation, is to ensure the habitability of our common planetary home becomes the most important of all common goods, as it is a necessary precondition for the fulfillment of the rest. Here politics, whose primary vocation is to serve the common good as an important and indispensable role to play. But also economics. That economics, etymologically is oikos nomos, caring for our common home. Just to give a small example, when you think after 2020, 2/3 of all wealth created went into the hands of the 1%, the richest 1% in the world. So it's not economics, it's all about profit. And the third part is education. Next slide. I've reached 15 minutes, 2 more minutes. Many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. A great cultural, spiritual and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal. And the seventh and the last point, with that we are done. So, and I'm in a way following up John Muntel's presentation. So how do we respond to all this? We are in the synod right now, and there is nothing more synodal, more collective than working together in rebuilding our common home. And next slide is about the 7 areas of the Laudato Si action platform. Next slide, please. The idea is to involve everyone. No one is left out. Families, parishes, dioceses, our schools and universities, hospitals, healthcare centers, businesses, cooperative farms, organizations, religious orders. And I'm happy to say that the Jesuits, Franciscans, Salesians, so many congregations, and this is an occasion to also invite the missionaries of Africa to join on this journey. The very last slide. Next slide. Yeah, and I congratulate you, Father Stan, and the entire congregation for having discovered, in response to Pope Francis' invitation, this new arena for mission. That today, mission has to be integral ecology. And remembering Jesus' own last words in Mark 16:15, go and preach the gospel, the good news, to every creature, not only to humanity, but to the entire creation. Thank you so very much for listening to me, and my apologies once again.
Thank you very much, Father. He highlighted the 7 elements of integral ecology. He made mention that the poor are mentioned 59 times. That the poor are mentioned 59 times. And he talked about migration and displacement. And very interesting for me was he talked about the point number 7 of the 7 elements of Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we will go to our third speaker, Don Luigi, the parish priest of the Uganda Martyrs in Rome. So Don Luigi is the parish priest of the Uganda Martyrs parish in Rome, and he's the contact person for the disabled and catechesis sector of the catechetical office of the diocese.